Welcome. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your position, lower your shoulders, and allow your body to settle. Now take a slow breath in through your nose and let it go gently through your mouth. There's no need to control your breathing, just notice it slowing on its own. Tonight's story is calm and unhurried, told softly and without anything graphic or disturbing. You don't need to stay awake or follow every detail. If your mind drifts, that's perfectly okay. Let the story move quietly in the background as you rest. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. You are safe, you are comfortable, and sleep can arrive whenever it's ready. The town did not notice the moment it became unsafe. There was no announcement, no warning, no sound to mark the change. It happened quietly, the way most dangerous things do. Streetlights continued to glow, people continued to walk home, doors continued to lock themselves at night, but something had shifted. The man, who would later be called the Night Listener, had always existed on the edge of things, not invisible, just unnoticed. Victim 1 was Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed liked certainty. He liked knowing what came next, because it meant nothing unexpected could happen. At 43, his life had become a series of repetitions. Work, walk, dinner, sleep. He found comfort in it. Every night he took the same path home from the mill. 4 blocks, 7 streetlights, one dark stretch near the river. That night Thomas felt watched, not in a dramatic way, just a faint awareness, like realising you've forgotten something important. He slowed slightly, and then told himself he was tired. He told himself he was imagining it. The Night Listener had already been following him for weeks, learning his pace, his breathing, the way his shoulders relaxed when he thought he was alone. When Thomas disappeared, the killer felt something he had not expected. Relief. Not excitement, not satisfaction. Relief, as if the tension had finally been resolved. Victim 2 was Elaine Porter. Elaine Porter believed in visibility. She believed that being seen meant being safe. She waved to neighbours. She spoke loudly. She wore light-coloured jackets at night. She wanted the world to notice her. Victim 3 was Lucas Meyer. Lucas Meyer was loud on the outside and chaotic inside. The Night Listener preferred people like Lucas. Distraction made them predictable. Headphones created distance from reality. Lucas never heard the man step closer. Afterwards, the killer stood for a long time where Lucas had vanished, listening to the echo of music still playing faintly through abandoned earbuds. It was then he realised something unsettling. He enjoyed the stillness, afterward more than the act itself. By the third disappearance, the killer had confirmed his theory. People weren't afraid of the dark. They were afraid of being alone, and he could give them that, briefly. Victim 4 was Maggie Collins. Maggie Collins intrigued him. She walked slowly, she hummed, she didn't look afraid. The Night Listener followed her longer than the others. He wondered if age changed awareness, if she could feel him the way he felt her. When she stopped humming, he knew she had noticed something. That moment, that shared awareness stayed with him. It was the first time he felt seen. Victim 5 was Daniel Ortiz. Daniel Ortiz was tired. The killer understood tiredness. It made the world blur at the edges. Daniel didn't look behind him, didn't question the presence across the street. Later, the Night Listener stood by Daniel's van and listened to the engine ticking as it cooled. He counted the seconds. He always counted. Victim 6, Hannah Brooks. Hannah Brooks disturbed him. She looked into the dark instead of away from it. Her camera lens lingered where others hurried past. For the first time, the Night Listener felt exposed. When her photo captured his shape, something shifted inside him. The watching gone both ways. The disappearances did not truly end the night they arrested him. For a while, the town pretended they had. People needed an ending they could understand. They wanted a moment where fear could be placed neatly behind them, labelled and contained. But fear is not something that respects closure. It changes shape, it becomes subtle, it learns how to sound like nothing at all. In the weeks that followed, nights arrived earlier. Not on the clock, but in the way people moved. Shops closed sooner. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Doors locked with a little more force than necessary. Even the river seemed quieter, as if it were waiting. Detective Monroe remained in town long after the case had been declared finished. Paperwork gave him an excuse, but it was not the reason. Something about the silence felt unfinished. It did not feel empty, it felt reserved. He returned often to the places where the victims had last been seen, not to search for evidence, there was none left, but to listen. He stood beneath street lights and near bus stops, by the library fence and along the edge of the river, letting the night speak its own language. He noticed how easily sound travelled there, how footsteps could be heard long before a person came into view, how the darkness didn't hide things so much as it simplified them. The man had understood this. Monroe visited the apartment again one evening, months after it had been cleared. New tenants had not yet moved in. The building manager said it still felt wrong to rent the place. Monroe didn't argue. He walked through the room slowly, noticing how little space there really was, how close everything felt, how easily someone could sit, very still, and learn an entire neighbourhood without ever being seen. He wondered how many nights the man had spent there without moving, listening to lives pass beneath his window, how many routines had been catalogued and memorised, how many people had unknowingly announced themselves into the dark. The town had begun to adjust in small, careful ways. People walked together more often. Someone always waited until another person reached their door before leaving. Porch lights stayed on. Radios murmured in empty kitchens long after their owners had gone to bed. It wasn't panic. It was adapting. On certain nights, Monroe noticed something else, a hesitation. People would pause on the sidewalk, scanning the streets before continuing on, as if expecting the night itself to respond. They had learned awareness, but they hadn't yet learned how to put it down. And awareness, one carried too long, becomes its own kind of weight. Monroe thought often about the victims, but not as endings. He thought of them as moments suspended in time. A man walking home tired but certain. A woman enjoying the quiet with her dog. A young man lost in music. An elderly woman humming. A delivery driver staring at his phone. And a girl lifting her camera towards the dark. 6 moments, 6 silences. They were not connected by violence. They were connected by listening. That understanding followed Monroe into his sleep. His dreams were not nightmares. They were ordinary. Streets, windows, breathing. In one dream, he stood in the middle of town while everyone else slept, aware of a presence that never approached and never left. When he woke, he felt rested. That unsettled him. 3 months after the arrest, a letter arrived at the station. It contained no threats, no demands, just a single sentence written with careful restraint. You listened too late. Monroe read it slowly. He did not feel anger. He did not feel fear. He felt recognition. The sentence was not meant to provoke. It was meant to be understood. He filed the letter away, but the words stayed with him. Times passed. Seasons changed. The town learned how to breathe again. Laughter returned to the streets. Children stayed out later. The night softened little by little until it almost felt like it used to. Almost. Because every now and then, someone would stop mid-step, convinced they had heard something just behind them. Someone would wake from a dream with the sense that a thought had been interrupted. Someone would realise they've been holding their breath without knowing why. Monroe eventually left town, but he carried it with him. He noticed patterns more now, pauses in conversation, the way people spoke differently when they thought no one was listening. He understood something he hadn't before. Listening doesn't end when the listener is gone. It lingers, and somewhere far from this town, the night continued to gather sound. Footsteps, voices, breathing. Not as threat, not yet, just as memory. Memory, left unattended, has a way of becoming something else. The night remains quiet for now, but quiet does not always mean empty. Sleep comes easily when you believe nothing is watching, and tonight that belief is enough for now. Time passed in a way that felt almost intentional, not quickly and not slowly, but with the steady confidence of something that knew it would not be interrupted. The town learned how to live with what had happened by not naming it. People spoke about the past in vague terms, referring to that period or those months, as if distance alone could soften memory. New routines formed, but they formed carefully. People still walked at night, but not without purpose. They moved with awareness, not fear. Awareness had become the town's new normal, woven quietly into daily life. It showed up in small choices, waiting until someone else was nearby before crossing the street. Lingering under streetlights, checking reflections in windows without fully realising why. Children who had been too young to remember the disappearances grew older. They learned rules without learning reasons. Don't walk alone too late. Keep your phone charged. Let someone know where you're going. The night becomes something to navigate instead of something to enjoy. Monroe felt the distance from the town more sharply than he expected. He'd returned to work, to a different jurisdiction, a different set of faces and streets. But the habits he had learned there followed him. He listened more closely now, not just for danger, but for the imbalance. He noticed when a room felt quiet too quickly, when someone spoke as if filling space rather than communicating, when silence felt deliberate instead of natural. Listening had become reflex. Some nights Monroe dreamed of standing on an empty street while sound gathered around him like fog. Footsteps echoed without direction, doors closed without being seen. In the dreams he never turned around. He never needed to. The presence behind him did not threaten, it observed. He always woke calm, and that disturbed him more than nightmares ever could. Back in the town, the apartment no longer stood empty. The new tenant arrived without ceremony. He introduced himself when necessary and disappeared when he wasn't. He kept his windows open, even when the weather cooled, enjoying the way the town spoke to him after dark, the rhythm of it, the predictable unpredictability of people moving through their lives. He did not think of himself as someone who listened too much. He thought of himself as someone who noticed. There's a difference, he believed. He learned the building quickly, which doors slammed, which stairs creaked, which neighbours slept with televisions on, letting voices spill into the hallway long after midnight. He learned how sound travelled through the walls and how silence lingered when no one thought to disturb it. On certain nights he stood very still and let the town move around him. Nothing happened, and that pleased him. Miles away, Monroe received a report that unsettled him without fully explaining why. A man had not returned home when expected. He arrived hours later, apologetic and confused, unable to account for where the time had gone. No crime, no evidence, just a gap. Monroe read the report twice. He told himself not to assign meaning to absence, but absence had taught him once before. In the town, the night remained calm. No sirens, no sudden changes, only the gradual adjustment of routines, like a body settling into a familiar position after long discomfort. The new tenant slept easily. The quiet suited him. The night did not change at all once. It never had. Change arrived in increments so small they felt accidental. A hesitation before answering a question, a long pause at a crosswalk, a moment of stillness where movement usually lived. A woman took a different route home without knowing why. A man checked behind him once, then laughed at himself. Someone woke just before dawn with the feeling that a thought had been interrupted mid-sentence. None of it felt urgent. That was the most unsettling part. When Rowe began keeping notes again, not officially, not in reports, just small observations written in the margins of his days, times, places, patterns that did not yet connect, but felt familiar in shape. He did not call anyone, he listened. In the town, the new tenant adjusted nothing outwardly. His days remained ordinary, his nights remained quiet, but internally he was learning something new. People had changed. They were louder than before, more intentional. They filled silence quickly, as if afraid of what might appear if they left empty. He found this interesting. He found it instructive. Silence, he realised, had become valuable, rare, and therefore, without noticing, he did not follow anyone. He did not need to. He learned their rhythms from a distance, the way footsteps slowed near darker stretches, the way conversations dropped when no one else was around, the way people breathed differently when they believed themselves unobserved. He told himself he was only studying behaviour. The night agreed with him. Another report crossed Monroe's desk, then another. Small things, delays, confusion, memory gaps that resolved themselves before anyone became alarmed. But the shape of them was familiar, too familiar. Monroe stood at his window one night, listening to a city that had never known the disappearances. He wondered how many places carried histories like this, unnoticed by those living inside them. How many listeners the night held. In the town, someone paused beneath a streetlight and felt briefly the sensation of being understood without being seen. The feeling passed. It always did. The night remained quiet, attentive, waiting, and whatever came next would not arrive loudly. It never does. The first sign was not panic, it was inconvenience. A woman named Rachel Henson did not arrive where she expected to be. That was all. No one used the word disappearance at first. It felt too heavy, too dramatic, for what was probably nothing. Rachel was 38. She worked late shifts at a small insurance office and took the long way home because it helped her think. She liked the feeling of walking when the town had thinned out, when conversations gave way to echoes and her thoughts could stretch without interruption. That night she left work at 9:42 p.m. She texted her sister at 9:46 complaining about the cold. The message ended with a period, which was unusual for her. She normally used exclamation points. Her sister noticed this later, long after it would have mattered. Rachel took her usual route, past the closed pharmacy, across the small bridge, along the street where lights flickered slightly before settling. She was halfway home when she slowed. Not because she saw something, because she felt a pause. It was subtle, the sense that the night had adjusted itself around her, the way a room feels different when someone else enters it quietly. She told herself it was nothing, fatigue, habit, memory borrowing fear from stories it had heard too often. She continued walking. Behind her, footsteps matched her pace. Not close enough to hurry her, not far enough to disappear. Rachel did not turn around. She told herself there was no reason to. The night felt familiar, calm, almost considerate. A breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere, a radio played softly through an open window. Her phone vibrated. She stopped to check it. There was no message. That was when the footsteps stopped too. Rachel stood very still. She listened. She waited for the night to correct itself, for sound to resume, for proof she was alone again. It didn't come. When she turned, there was no one there. No shape, no movement, only the quiet, now settled in a way that felt deliberate. Rachel took a breath and laughed softly to herself. She was tired, that's all. She told herself this as she resumed walking, quicker now, not running, but longer, unhurried. She never reached the bridge. Her phone was found the next morning near the guardrail, screen dark, battery still half full. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, and no urgency in the air, just absence. By the time the word disappearance was used, it had already been too late once before. Miles away, Monroe woke before dawn with the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. Not fear, not certainty, alignment. He did not know Rachel's name. He did not know the details, but he listened to this quiet of his room and felt the same shape he had felt years ago. A pause. In the town, the night remained calm. Streetlights hummed. Morning arrived on schedule. People went to work, and conversations moved forward. Only the night knew something had been removed, and the night, patient as ever, kept listening. Morning arrived the way it always did. Light slid across the rooftops. Birds returned to familiar places. Alarms sounded in houses where people still believed the day would have been expected. For a few hours, Rachel Henson's absence existed only as a minor disruption, a delay that could still be explained away. Her sister called her phone again at 7:12 a.m. It rang, and rang, and then stopped. By mid-morning, concern had replaced patience. By noon, concern had turned into something sharper. Co-workers mentioned that Rachel had never missed a shift without notice. A supervisor checked the office security log and confirmed the time she had left the building, 9:42 p.m. The detail settled heavily in the room. Someone remembered seeing her coat still hanging on the back of her chair. Someone else mentioned that she always took the long way home. These were offered gently, as if speaking too firmly might make them real. By afternoon, the police were notified. They walked the route carefully, not with urgency, but with the cautious optimism of people who had hoped they were about to be embarrassed by how unnecessary their concern would turn out to be. They found the phone near the bridge, exactly where someone might pause to check a message. There were no marks on the guardrail, no broken glass, no indication that anything unusual had happened at all. This was when the quiet changed. Not dramatically, just enough. People began to speak more softly. A few neighbours stepped outside and watched the street longer than usual. The bridge became a place people noticed instead of passed. Someone said, "This feels familiar," and immediately apologised for saying it out loud. Denial lingered, but it no longer stood alone. That night, the town sounded different again, not crowded with fear, not tempted by it, but tuned, as if everyone had adjusted their volume slightly downward. Television stayed on longer, windows closed earlier, and conversations ended sooner. No one said the name. No one said again. Miles away, Monroe sat awake, long past midnight, a file open on his desk that he'd not meant to retrieve. He told himself he was reviewing old work for context, for closure, for reasons that made sense on paper, but what he was really doing was listening for something he recognised. He read the initial report twice, then a third time. He noticed what was missing more than what was present. The lack of urgency, the lack of force, the absence of chaos, the pause. Monroe leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Rachel Henson. He said the name once, quietly, as if listening to how it settled in the room. It fit. In the town, the new tenant stood at his window that same night, watching light fade from the street. He noticed which houses went dark first, which radios remained on, which footsteps hurried now, and which pretended not to. He felt no urgency, only curiosity. The night felt receptive, attentive, as if it had been waiting for something to return to its familiar shape. He listened, and in the listening he felt something he had not felt before. Not relief, not completion, but possibility. Somewhere nearby a woman paused at the edge of the bridge and felt the air thicken around her. She checked her phone and then slipped it into her pocket without unlocking it. She did not know why. She suddenly wanted to get home quickly. She walked faster. Behind her the night adjusted. Nothing happened this time. By morning, the town would use careful language, words like missing and search and procedure. The old words hovered nearby, but they were not invited in yet. Still, the night had learned something, and so had someone else. The quiet was no longer empty. It was usable, and somewhere between attention and intention, listening deepened, slowly, patiently. The decision was made without ceremony. Monroe didn't announce it. He didn't call ahead. He packed a small bag, locked his apartment, and left before dawn, as if moving quietly might prevent the thought from fully forming. The road back felt shorter than it should have. Familiar exits appeared sooner than expected. Landmarks surfaced from memory without effort, as if the town had been waiting to be remembered. Monroe drove with the radio off, listening to the low hum of the tyres and the steady rhythm of the engine. By the time he crossed the bridge into town, the sky was just beginning to lighten. Nothing looked different. That unsettled him. He parked near the station and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, watching the street wake up. A man unlocked a storefront. A woman walked her dog. Ordinary movement arranged in patterns Monroe already knew. Inside the station, the atmosphere was restrained. Voices were calm. Papers moved from one desk to another, but beneath it, Monroe felt a quiet tension, like a room holding its breath without realizing it was doing so. The officers greeted him politely. Some recognized him immediately. Others knew his name without knowing his face, and one asked why he was there. They didn't need to. He reviewed the case file alone in a small room with a window that overlooked the parking lot. He read slowly, letting each detail settle before moving on. The time Rachel left work, the location of a phone, the lack of witnesses. The absence of urgency in the report told him everything. This is how it started before. Monroe walked the route that evening as the sun lowered. He didn't hurry, he didn't look for signs, he listened. The town still spoke in the same quiet language. Footsteps echoed where they used to. The river carried the sound the way it always had. At the bridge, he stopped. The air felt thicker there, not colder, just heavier, as if the space remembered something it had once held. He stayed until the streetlights came on. Nothing happened, and yet Monroe felt certain. That night he checked into the same motel he had stayed in years before. They recognized him but said nothing. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and time. Monroe lay on the bed without turning on the television. He listened to the building settle. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere else, footsteps passed and faded. The night did not feel hostile. It felt attentive. Across town, the new tenant noticed a car he did not recognize parked near the station. He did not think much of it. People came and went. But later, standing at his window, he realized the night felt slightly different. More focused. He smiled, just barely. The town had begun to listen again. And Monroe, lying awake in a familiar room, understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't a return, it was a continuation. And the night, patient as ever, had plenty of time left. Monroe believed experience would protect him, not in a reckless way. He didn't think himself immune to failure or blind to consequence. Experience had given him a confidence he trusted more than instinct. He had learned how patterns behaved. He had learned how nights unfolded when something was wrong. And that belief, quiet, reasonable, unspoken, was his first mistake. He began by doing what had worked before. He walked. He listened. He stayed visible without being present. He allowed the town to move around him without interference. In the past, this patience had paid off. He had allowed things to reveal themselves, but the town had changed. People noticed him. Not consciously, not with suspicion, just enough to alter their behaviour. Conversations softened when he passed. Footsteps adjusted their pace, and doors closed a little sooner. Awareness bent the rhythm of the night in small ways Monroe didn't immediately account for. He mistook caution for normacy. On his second night back, Monroe took the route back Rachel Henson had walked. He chose the same time she would have passed the bridge. He stood where her phone had been found and let the quiet surround him. He stayed too long. Not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to become part of the pattern. Across town, the new tenant noticed the change immediately. Not the man himself at first, but the disturbance he caused, the way sound adjusted around him, the way people hesitated without knowing why. Someone was listening incorrectly. That, he thought, that surfaced, uninvited but clear, listening incorrectly. The new tenant watched the street more closely that night. He noticed the unfamiliar stillness beneath the bridge, the man who stood there without moving, without purpose, without belonging to the flow of the evening. Observation, he knew, was the most effective when unnoticed. Monroe returned to the motel later than planned. He reviewed notes he hadn't realised he'd been taking. Times, locations, small impressions that felt useful simply because they felt familiar. He did not notice the gap. He slept poorly. The next morning, Monroe spoke with officers at the station. He asked questions he believed were neutral. But this itself can be revealing. One officer mentioned seeing Monroe near the bridge the night before. Another commented on how he was out walking. Monroe smiled. He nodded. He filed the information away without recognising it for what it was: visibility. That afternoon, the new tenant walked the neighbourhood for the first time since moving in. Not far, just enough to hear the town from a different angle. He passed the motel and slowed slightly, registering the sound of the door closing behind him. Someone else was learning the night. That evening, Monroe adjusted his routine, believing variation would correct his earlier misstep. He chose a different street, a different time. He let the town settle before entering it. But adjustment is still action, and action leaves traces. The new tenant stood at his window and smiled again, a little more this time, not because he recognised Monroe yet, but because he recognised the shape of the error. Someone had mistaken presence for invisibility. That night, the town slept unevenly, not poorly, just lightly. The kind of sleep where dreams are easily interrupted and silence feels crowded. Monroe woke before dawn with the sense that he had spoken out of turn without using words. He lay still and listened. Somewhere a radio played softly. Somewhere else footsteps passed and did not return. The night adjusted itself once more, careful not to draw attention. Monroe would understand later what had changed, that the listening was no longer one-sided, and that his first mistake had not been coming back. It had been believed the night still belonged to him. Monroe did not notice the guidance at first. It felt like choice. He chose which streets to walk. He chose when to pause and when to move on. He believed he was adjusting intelligently, responding to what the town offered him. That belief made the redirection seamless. The night did not resist him. It accommodated him. On his third evening back, Monroe planned to return to the bridge just after 9. He changed his mind halfway there, drawn instead by a side street where the light seemed dimmer than usual. He told himself the adjustment was instinct. Across town, the new listener stood at his window and waited. He had not followed Monroe. He had not needed to. Monroe's presence bent the night in predictable ways. People reacted to attention without understanding why. Sound shifted, silence pulled where it had not before. That was all the information the listener required. Monroe walked slower than usual that night. He paused where footsteps echoed more clearly. He avoided places where his presence might feel too obvious. He thought he was becoming more careful. He was becoming more readable. At the edge of the park, a path curved gently out of sight. Monroe followed it, without quite remembering deciding to do so. The trees muted, the city sounds. The night felt contained there, smaller, more deliberate. He stood still and listened. Behind him, nothing happened. In front of him, the path remained empty. The stillness felt complete, like a held breath. Monroe left the park unsettled but unable to explain why. He returned to the motel and made notes that did not connect. Streets that led nowhere, times that no longer aligned. He told himself the confusion was temporary. Confusion was expected. The new listener noticed the change immediately. Monroe was no longer moving through the night. he was being placed within it. That realization brought a sense of calm, not excitement, not anticipation. Calm. This was how listening was supposed to work. Influence did not announce itself, it suggested. The next day, Monroe adjusted again. He asked fewer questions. He walked less. He observed from a distance. He believed restraint would restore balance. But restraint is still response, and response is information. That evening, a streetlight near the motel failed. It did not shatter or spark, it simply went dark. Monroe noticed it without concern and altered his route instinctively. The listener noted the adjustment. Monroe's movements narrowed, not physically, mentally. He began favouring certain streets, certain times. He avoided others without realising he was doing so. The night shaped him the way the water shapes stone, gently, persistently. On the fifth night, Monroe stood once more near the bridge. He did not stay long. Something in the air urged him onward. He followed the feeling, believing it was his own. Across town, the listener closed his window and turned off the light. The town slept lightly. Nothing happened, and that was the point. Monroe returned to his room uneasy, aware that the night had learned him better than he had learned it. He lay awake, listening to the building breathe, so doors opening and closing elsewhere, to footsteps he could not place. For the first time since returning, Monroe considered the possibility that he was not observing a pattern. He was inside one, and the night, patient and attentive, continued its quiet work. The woman's name was Claire Donnelly. No one said it out loud yet because no one had reason to. She was simply another person moving through the town, carrying her life in small, ordinary habits. She worked at a print shop near the edge of downtown and often stayed late to finish orders that no one else wanted to rush. Claire liked the night for its honesty. It did not demand conversation. It did not rush her. When she locked the shop and stepped into the sidewalk, she felt herself relax, as if the day had finally let go. She took the same route home each night, though she never thought of it that way, past the park, across the narrow street with uneven pavement, through the block where houses sat back from the road and sound travelled farther than expected. On her first walk after Rachel's disappearance, she noticed nothing. On the second, she felt the quiet settle sooner than usual. On the third, she slowed without knowing why. That night, Monroe was elsewhere, following a lead that felt promising but went nowhere. He stood near the river and listened to water moving over stone, convinced the sound would offer clarity if he let it. It didn't. Across town, the listener noticed Claire's rhythm immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. Her pace was unhurried, her attention inward. She filled silence with thought instead of sound. He did not follow her. He listened from a distance. The night adjusted itself gently around her. Streetlights hummed, a window closed, and somewhere a radio turned off. Claire paused at the edge of the park, checking her phone without unlocking it. She felt a familiar hesitation, the kind that had no words attached. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was tired. She continued walking. The listener noted the moment. Monroe returned to the motel later than planned. He made notes that felt incomplete, names that did not yet connect. He slept in fragments, waking to the sound of his own breathing, aware of the night pressing gently against the building. In the early morning, Claire dreamed of walking down a street that kept lengthening in front of her. The houses repeated, the light stayed on, no one looked out. She woke calm. The next evening, Claire stayed later at work. Not intentionally. Time passed more quickly than expected. When she stepped outside, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the night had settled early. She noticed footsteps behind her. They were not close. They were not hurried. They matched her pace. Claire did not turn round. She told herself she would if the sound continued, and it didn't. The footsteps faded just as suddenly as they appeared. She laughed quietly and shook her head, embarrassed by her own imagination. The listener watched from the edge of the street and learned something important. Claire noticed that mattered. Monroe, walking a different route that night, felt a sudden sharp awareness that he had missed something. Not an event, a moment. the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself twice. He stopped and listened. The town was quiet, too balanced. Somewhere, Claire reached her door and paused before unlocking it. She looked back down the street, unsettled but unable to explain why. Nothing was there. The night had already adjusted, and listening, careful and patient, continued. The crossing happened without significance. No one noticed it at the time. That was the nature of it. Two paths touched briefly and then moved on, leaving behind nothing that could be pointed to later as proof. Claire left work later than usual again. The print shop lights went dark behind her, and the sound of the lock clicking into place echoed longer than expected. She paused, listening, aware of the quiet settling too quickly around her. Across town, Monroe stepped out of the motel and chose a route he hadn't planned to take. He told himself it was instinct, the kind that came from years of doing this work. In truth, he was responding to a subtle pressure he could not name. Both of them reached the park within minutes of each other. Claire entered from the south path, her footsteps soft on the gravel. Monroe approached from the opposite side, staying near the edge of the trees where the light fell unevenly. Neither knew the other was there. The night held them apart. Claire slowed near the centre of the park. She felt watched, not in a way that frightened her, but in a way that made her suddenly aware of herself. The way she walked, the sound she made, the fact she was alone. She stopped and pretended to check her phone. Monroe heard her footsteps and paused. He did not see her clearly, just a shape in the dim light. A woman standing still, waiting for something or someone. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a quiet recognition that something mattered here. He did not move closer. That was his second mistake. He told himself that approaching would startle her, that observation was safer, that patience would reveal more than action. He stayed where he was, listening. Claire felt the pressure ease. The sense of being watched loosened its grip. She slipped her phone into her pocket and continued walking, unaware of how close she had been to something important. Monroe watched her leave the park. He did not follow. Across town, the listener noticed the disturbance immediately. The park had shifted. Sound had bent where it should have. Two attentions have overlapped briefly, creating a ripple the night could not completely smooth over. That intrigued him. He adjusted. Claire reached home with a lingering sense of unease she could not explain. She locked the door and stood in the hallway longer than necessary, listening to the house settle around her. Monroe returned to the motel and settled in a different way. He reviewed his notes and realised there was a gap he could not account for, a moment where instinct had gone quiet. That absence worried him. The night settled again, but it did not forget the overlap. Two listeners had nearly noticed each other, and someone else had been paying very close attention. Monroe did not recognise the insight when it arrived. At first it felt like irritation, a sense that something simple had been overlooked, that he had been solving the wrong problem without knowing it. He sat at a small desk in the motel room, papers spread out in front of him, and felt the familiar urge to reorganise everything. He resisted it. That pause mattered. Instead of rearranging the facts, he listened to them, not the words on the page, but the spaces between them. He noticed how often he had written noting observed, how many times ended with no events, no sighting, no conclusions. He had been waiting for escalation, for movement, for the kind of mistake people make when they act too quickly. But nothing had rushed, nothing had pushed, everything had adjusted. The realisation came quietly then, without drama. He wasn't chasing someone who acted, he was circling someone who listened. And that meant Monroe had been doing exactly what the other man wanted him to do. Be present, be noticeable, be predictable. Monroe leaned back and closed his eyes. He replayed the park in his mind, the woman standing still, his decision not to approach, the way the night had seemed to exhale afterwards, smoothing itself back into place. That hadn't been restraint, it had been permission. He understood now what his real mistake had been. Not just visibility, not just routine, but assumption. He had assumed the night worked the same way it always used to, that patterns belonged to him because he recognised them. But patterns don't belong to anyone. They repeat for whoever is patient enough to watch. Monroe stood and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into a shadow. He stood at the window and listened without trying to interpret. Cars passed, a voice drifted up from the parking lot and faded, and somewhere a door closed. Ordinary sounds, but arranged carefully. For the first time since returning, Monroe stopped moving entirely. He did not walk. He did not observe. He did not adjust. He let the night move without him. That decision felt wrong, which told him it was necessary. Across town, the listener noticed the absence immediately. Something had gone quiet where it shouldn't have. Pressure he had been applying no longer returned information. The man who had been bending so reliably had gone still. Stillness, when expected, was disruptive. The listener stood at his window longer than usual, listening harder, narrowing focus. He did not feel threatened, he felt curious. Claire slept lightly that night. She dreamed of the park again, but this time she noticed something new. In the dream there was a place where sound stopped completely, as if the world had decided not to continue past a certain point. She woke before dawn and did not go back to sleep. Monroe sat in the dark until morning. He had learned the shape of the trap. What he did not know was how deep he already stood inside it. The night remained calm, attentive, waiting to see who would move first. Monroe did not announce the change. He understood now that declaration was another form of noise. The noise was exactly what the night knew how to absorb. Instead, he altered himself in ways that could not immediately be explained. He stopped walking familiar routes. He left the motel at times that made no sense. Too early to be useful and too late to be expected. He entered streets, paused briefly, and turned back without reason. He allowed himself not to be seen in places where nothing happened, an absence where he had once lingered. The town reacted before anyone realized why. Footsteps hesitated, conversations drifted. People felt a vague discomfort they could not attach to anything concrete. The night, used to accommodating Monroe's predictability, found fewer points of reference. Across town, the listener felt the disturbance of a thinning of information. The man who had once responded so reliably had become inconsistent. His presence no longer bent sound in unexpected ways. Sometimes he appeared and did nothing. Sometimes he was absent where influence should have returned. This was not resistance, it was refusal. The listener found this interesting. He adjusted in response. Through adjustment now required effort. He could no longer infer Monroe's movements from absence alone. He had to listen more closely, narrow focus, reduce assumptions. That narrowing, subtle and precise, marked the first moment of risk. Monroe sensed it without seeing it. The night felt closer now, not heavier but sharper. Sound seemed to arrive with more intention. The quiet pressed inward rather than outward. He kept moving. He sat in a diner long after closing time, listening to the hum of refrigeration units and the slow breathing of the cook asleep in the back. He stood beneath streetlights that buzzed faintly and left before anyone could mark him as out of place. He walked past the park without entering it. That mattered. The listener waited for Monroe where he expected him to appear and felt nothing in return. The absence did not resolve itself, it lingered. The listener smiled, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement. The game had changed. Claire felt the shift as well, though she could not name it. Her walk home felt less pressured, as if something that had been leaning into her thoughts had pulled away slightly. She still felt watched at moments, but the feeling no longer followed a straight line. She slept more deeply that night. Monroe did not. He lay awake, listening to the motel, aware that he had made himself less readable, but also more interesting. Breaking the pattern had not removed attention, it had redirected it. And somewhere in the town, listening sharpened. The night does not punish change, it adapts, and it had begun to adapt to Monroe. The night began to feel deliberate, not threatening, not rushed. Deliberate in a way, a hand rests on a door just before opening it. Monroe sensed it in a way the town responded to him now. His broken patterns no longer unsettled the night. They had been absorbed, accounted for. The streets no longer adjusted around his presence, they waited. He He stopped trying to confuse what was listening. Confusion was a language the night understood too well. Instead, Monroe simplified. He reduced his movements. He chose fewer places. He stayed longer when he stopped. He allowed the town to feel him again, but without predictability. Presence without rhythm. The listener noticed immediately. The man at the window no longer tried to follow Monroe's movements. He didn't need to. Monroe was doing something far more dangerous now. He was offering himself as a fixed point. Listening did not resist this. It converged. Claire felt the convergence before either man acknowledged it. The town had grown quieter around her again, but this time the quiet felt focused, directional, as if attention were being drawn toward a single evening, a single span of hours. She found herself lingering at work without reason, checking the clock more often, listening to the building breathe around her. When she stepped outside, the air felt held, not heavy, held. Monroe stood at the edge of the park that night. He did not enter. He remained where the light thinned, but did not disappear. He had chosen this place because it allowed visibility without exposure, a boundary. He listened. Across town, the listener closed his window for the first time since moving in. He did not need the night amplification anymore. The shape had become clear. Monroe was waiting. That was acceptable. The listener took his time leaving the apartment. He chose a route that did not belong to him, one that allowed sound to arrive before sight. He walked without urgency, letting the town rearrange itself ahead of him. This was not pursuit, it was alignment. Claire walked home later than usual. She did not choose the park. She did not avoid it either. She simply found herself there, following a path she had walked before without consequence. The night narrowed. Monroe heard her footsteps and recognized the rhythm immediately, not from memory, but from relevance. That was the sound that mattered. He stepped forward slightly enough to be seen without startling. Claire stopped. She did not scream. She did not run. She recognized something in his stillness. Monroe spoke her name. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough. The sound disrupted the shape of the night. Somewhere nearby, the listener stopped walking. This was unexpected. Names were a form of interference. The town held its breath. Monroe felt it then, the pressure, the focus, the attention collapsing inward. He understood that the ending would require, even if he did not know yet its shape. Claire stood beside him now, close enough to feel warmth. Neither of them looked back, because the night no longer needed to hide. It was listening, and listening had begun to choose. The night did not rush the decision, it never had. Monroe stood beside Claire at the edge of the park, both of them still enough to feel the air move between breaths. He did not turn, he did not need to. He could feel the attention settling, narrowing like a lens coming into focus. This was the moment the night had been shaping. Not a confrontation, not a chase, a recognition. Monroe understood now what listening had always been about. It wasn't observation. It wasn't control. It was permission. The night gave space to whoever filled it most patiently. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Monroe spoke, not to Claire, but to the quiet itself. "You don't need to finish this," he said. His voice was calm, not pleading, not commanding, just present. The listener stopped several steps away, still unseen. He had not expected words. Words created shape. Shape created limitation. He listened carefully. Claire felt the pressure ease slightly, though she did not understand why. The sense of being narrowed, of being chosen, loosened just enough for her to breathe more deeply. The listener considered the moment. He had waited for alignment, for readiness, for inevitability. But what stood before him now was something he had not accounted for. Interruption. Not chaos, not fear. Interruption offered without resistance. The night held all three of them in balance. No one moved. Sound travelled farther than usual, somewhere beyond the park. A door closed softly. A radio turned off. The town remained unaware. Finally, the listener stepped back, not retreating, releasing. The night adjusted immediately, redistributing its attention, smoothing the pressure it had gathered. The shape dissolved as quietly as it had formed. Monroe felt it happened and knew without certainty, but with clarity, that this was the ending he would get. Not justice, not closure, but containment. Claire did not see the listener. She only felt the moment pass, like waking from a dream that left no images behind. Monroe placed a hand lightly on her shoulder and guided her towards the streetlight. They walked together until the night widened again. In the days that followed, nothing happened. No more disappearances, no letters, and no signs. The town exhaled without realizing it had been holding its breath. Monroe left shortly after. He did not look back. Some stories do not improve with repetition. Some endings exist only once. The apartment remained occupied. The window stayed closed more often now. The night continued to listen, but without focus, without intent. Listening, after all, is not dangerous. It is what listens back that matters. And now, as you lie here, the night around you is doing what it does best, holding still, letting thoughts drift, allowing rest. There is nothing waiting, nothing watching, only quiet, steady breathing, and sleep. The night has finished telling its story, and you can let go now.